panel ni Dr. Vega, puno ng salita.
Magandang hapon sa ating lahat. Isang karangalan ang ipakilala sa inyo ang ating plenaryong tagapanayam sa hapong ito, na si Dr. Gregory D.S. Anderson. Siya ay Direktor ng Living Tongues Institute for Endangered Languages at Research Fellow, University of South Africa. Nagpapakadalubhasa siya sa topolohiya, historical, komparatibong linguistika, ugnayan ng mga wika, at nanganganib na wika. Nakapaglathala na siya ng maraming aklat, gaya ng Auxiliary Verb Construction, the verb at Language Contact in South Central Siberia. Nagsagawa rin siya ng malawakang pag-aaral tungkol sa mga wikang Siberian Turkic, mga wika ng pamilya Munda ng India, mga wikang Tibeto-Burman ng Hilagang Silagang India Boroshaki, maraming wika ng Hilagang Central Africa at mga wika ng Katimugang Rio ng Pacific sa Papua New Guinea at Vanuatu. Siya po ay si Dr. Gregory D.S. Anderson. Ipapakilala ko na rin po ang mga tagapanayam ng panel. Una po ay si Professor Salim Mizud. Siya ay Senior Research Fellow sa African Leadership Center sa School of Global Affairs of King's College London at kalihim pandangal ng Foundation for Endangered Languages. Nag-aral si Salim ng Antropolohiya at Linguistika sa mga universidad ng London at Paris. Nagpakadalubhasa sa mga kultura at sistemang politikal ng Afrika na may partikular na tuon sa silangan at hilagang Afrika. Dati siyang lecturer ng etnografiya at sociolinguistika ng North Africa sa Sorbonne at sa maraming taon ay broadcaster ng BBC World Service at iba pang media at regular na commentator sa mga usaping North African. Mahigit 3 dekada siyang naging practitioner ng karapatang pantao sa mga international na NGO at sa United Nations. At ilan sa mga naging tuon niya ay ang karapatan ng mga minorya at katutubo, karapatan ng mga bata at karapatang linguistika. Dati siyang puno ng seksyon ng Hilagang Afrika ng tanggapan ng mataas ng Commissioner para sa Karapatang Pantao ng UN at pinamunuan ang mga misyon sa larangan para sa iba pang ahensya ng UN. Ang sunod po ay ang pangkat na pinangungunahan ni Dr. Josephine S. Daguman. Siya ay Senior Consultant sa Field Linguistics ng Translators Association of the Philippines Incorporated. Siya at ang kanyang pangkat ay tumutulong sa mga katutubong pamayanang kultural na nais masuri ang kanilang mga wika tungo sa pagbuo ng standard na ortografiya, pagbuo ng mga materyales para sa pag-unlad ng kanilang mga lipunan at pagdisenyo ng mga programa sa muling pagpapasigla ng wika. Kasama sa pangkat niya ay si Binibining Rosario S. Viloria. Siya ang coordinator ng ladderized training program sa Community Development Major sa Language Development na magkatuwang na pinatatakbo ng TAP at Asian School of Development and Cross-Cultural Studies. Siya at si Josephine ay mga co-facilitator ng kursong Language Development ng programang iyon. Magkasama nilang pinangangasiwaan ang Participatory Action Research ng mga mag-aaral sa mga pamayanan. Kasama na rin sa pangkat nila si Binibining Lerma Abelia. Isa si Lerma sa mga trainee ng programang Transformational Language Development Program noong 2016. Siya at si Aris Aguilar ay nagsagawa ng Participatory Action Research hinggil sa kalagayan ng wikang tinagbanwa sa isang bayang kanugnog ng kanilang bayan sa Coron Island, Palawan. Kasama pa din sa kanilang pangkat si Binibining Rodelyn Aguilar, Lumahok si Rodeline sa mga focus group discussion na isinagawa para sa saliksik. Nasaksihan niya ang pagkamulat ng pamayanan hinggil sa kalagayan ng kanilang wika at bahagi na siya ngayon ng pagsisikap na pasiglahin ang buhay nito. Kabilang sina Lerma at Rodeline sa mga pinili na mga nakatatanda ng pamayanan na tipunin ang resulta ng Tinagbanwa Language Conference at buuin ang ortografiyang Tinagbanwa na isusumiti sa Komisyon sa Wikang Filipino para sa aprobasyon. Sila po ang mga bumubuo ng tagapanayam ng ating panel sa hapong ito.
Mga kababayan, para sa kanyang panayam na survey at kasalukuyang estado ng nanganganib na wika, narito si Dr. Gregory D.S. Anderson.
Thank you. Just want to thank the organizers for putting this together and inviting me to be a part of it. Excuse me. So I'm going to be speaking on a survey about language endangerment in Asia. It's applying a particular model that I call the language hotspots model. So first of all, we're here because the global language extinction crisis is a grave social issue facing us in the 21st century. Outside of our domain, not widely known to be a grave extinction risk that outweighs most biological species extinction risks significantly, and yet it still remains largely unknown issue outside of our fairly esoteric world. Before I start talking about sort of averages and levels of endangerment and trends of endangerment, just want to establish some terms here. So I'll occasionally make reference to a 6-point numerical scale that various sources have assigned a level of endangerment to various languages. So from the higher the number, the less endangered, the lower the number, the more endangered on this scale. So down here, we're dealing with languages that are in an extreme state of erosion, as opposed to languages where this process of shift has just begun or hasn't actually started, but the ecological or environmental circumstances are ripe for language shift to occur. Okay, so just so that you understand what these roughly terms correspond to, extinct means there's no speakers. Moribund roughly means great-grandparent age is the average age, and then take a generation down from there back to, technically speaking, a language should be considered endangered at the point that children are no longer learning it. That is, once the intergenerational transmission has stopped or has been disrupted, efforts have to be made to restore that process, or the language will continue on this path. And all things being equal, unless changes are made, then it will disappear. Okay, so how many endangered languages are there? Well, how many languages in the world are there? How many dialects? This is just one set of numbers, okay? Roughly speaking, whether or not these are absolute numbers are correct, assuredly they're not, okay? But this is a particular data set that was counted, and the one thing that we'll see here is that fortunately threatened is still the largest category, so the least endangered level. Now I should give you a little bit of information on what the level 3 and level 5 are, because these are maybe not typical in the endangerment literature. So a locally endangered language would mean in some communities it's healthy, that is, transmission is happening or it's threatened, and in others it's already starting the shift. So this could be highly localized, village to village. That we would call a locally endangered language. The next level of local distribution would be where it's endangered or okay in some areas and severely endangered or extinct in others. Okay, so these are just the gradations that we use, because that's a scenario that we find in a lot of different places in the world. So we've come up with these sort of intermediate stages. Okay, so why do languages become endangered? Okay, this is a complex question, but if you wanted to reduce it to a general principle, it has to do with the internalization of negative valuation of their identity associated with that language use that's held by the broader community, okay? So there's an internalization of an ideology or an attitude that devalues that identity, and then the people shift because it's a vector of discrimination they can control, okay? So it's a logical response to discrimination. So what does this mean? It means we have to stop discriminating, okay? So that's not as easy as it sounds. Language biases are deeply rooted. Skip this, we know. Once it starts, it rarely stops unless we hear some of the success stories that Michael was talking about earlier and such. These are wonderful things to hear. Okay. So this is basically the demographic pyramid of the distribution of the languages in the world. The vast majority of the people of the world speak a very small number of languages, and the vast majority of the world's languages are spoken by a very small percentage of people. Okay, so we have this inverse pyramid relationship going. And up here, you know, half or more of the world's language is spoken by 0.2%, okay? These are the areas where we're sort of inherently at risk, regardless of whether it's shifting or not, okay? So where are they concentrated? Okay, they're concentrated in certain areas. Language endangerment is not evenly distributed in the same way that language diversity is not evenly distributed. And there is a very specific reason why language endangerment is found in the distribution that it is. And this has to do with what we call the ecology of the endangerment. That is the psychosocial circumstances that have led to the endangerment or favors abandonment of languages are not evenly distributed for specific historical and political reasons, okay? So, where we find the gravest situations are former settlement colonies, okay? So this is Siberia, most of the New World, and a few other areas, Southern Africa, for example. The Nuba Hills is a special, it is a type of colonization, but it's more of the old school, let's murder off the people in the area and take their land type that was happening there. But it was just happening in the 20th century and not in the 17th, 18th, or 19th centuries. Okay, so the areas that we find concentrations of languages endangered for these various reasons, we'll call the language hotspots, okay? And the reason that language hotspots exist, as I mentioned, is because we have these historical circumstances that have led to them. From a other perspective, they're a promotional metaphor for understanding language endangerment sort of on a smaller scale than 6,000 or 3,500 or 7,000 numbers that make people's brains shut down. 12.5 language hotspots, people can kind of get their head around, hey, let's rally around these areas. So it's really kind of a promotional metaphor for raising awareness about language endangerment. Okay. So where are these? Well, what they are areas where we find a confluence of three factors: high level of genetic diversity, high level of endangerment, and relatively low levels of documentation. So there are roughly 12.5 language hotspots around the world. There are other areas where there's endangered languages, but they don't meet one or another set of those criteria that I just said, so it's not that they aren't important, it's just they're not included in this model. So we're going to talk about the four in the middle here in Asia. Okay, this is roughly the distribution globally of the global language hotspots. We'll see on this next slide, which has points correlating to the languages that correlate to the level of endangerment. Red and orange is more endangered, green and yellow less endangered. So we can see very clear global trends of concentrations of the red in these former settlement colonies. And we find more green and yellows in other circumstances. So So there's basically a split between kind of settlement colonies where you have extreme levels of endangerment and shift that's already occurred, and these new areas of expansion of powerful languages as is happening in the rest of the world, basically. Now, there's a couple of other models here I'll talk about that explain these distribution. All right, so first case study, I'm going to talk about Siberia. This is a map of Siberia at contact, that is, say, 16th, 17th century time. Large areas inhabited by ethnic groups or related sets of ethnic groups. These correspond to the language families. You can see Tungusic was a giant family in the old days. Exploitation by Russian authorities and government and economic concerns have left a severe mark on Siberia physically and in the terms of the demographics. So this is an all too common scene in Siberia. Clear cutting of the forests. This is a more accurate representation of the languages of Siberia today, where languages are found basically in a few speakers in a single village. So not these giant spaces, not these huge polygons on the map, but points on the map that are more accurately reflective of the distribution of the languages today. This would be that same map, but with the color coding of endangerment. Awful lot of reds and oranges in Siberia. Siberia endangerment is very severe. Funnily enough, it seems to work better pointing it at this. All right, so in addition to language shift, that is abandoning native language in favor of the socially dominant language, that is Russian here, we're also seeing a turnover in the structure of these languages as they basically become L1 Russian users, calquing words from their original language into Russian syntax. This would be a case here. So Abakan Hakas is a Turkic language. Turkic languages typically have strings of nominalized, non-finite structures followed by a single finite verb at the end. And so you have subordinate clauses that are nominalized and precede the main clause. This has been replaced now by a main clause, then followed by a subordinate clause introduced by the borrowed Russian complementizer. So it's fully restructured the sentences to look like Russian, but using native vocabulary, except for the complementizer, for which they had no native word because they didn't use complementizers, so they simply borrowed the form. So they borrowed the form and the syntax, basically, with this. Okay, so this is what's happening in Siberian languages. Even the ones that are still spoken are basically eroding and converging on the Russian type. Okay, so the language hotspots model acknowledges that most languages are embedded within complex hierarchies. And these hierarchies basically, in a sense, cap the upward mobility that many of the lower communities have. So if you come from a lower on this hierarchy rank and community, you're unlikely to be able to get past too many of these languages. Now, in the case of Siberia and settlement colonies, it almost doesn't matter what the gradations above the top level is, okay? You get just like gradations of lesser things that are in trouble, okay? Now, in other countries where you don't have a settlement colony legacy, that is most countries in Asia would follow into this category, you have a different dynamic going on where you often have several levels of layered hierarchies of languages. Now, there's some countries for which this isn't true, but it's true in a lot of them. Okay, so we basically go from the official language to the kind of enfranchised minority groups to the less enfranchised groups to the fully invisible non-recognized groups. Okay, so that's the sort of hierarchy. Okay, turning now to a different area, but one that has a very real connection in terms of the ecological conditions that have given rise to the endangerment in the areas. We'll turn now to Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asia is relevant here because most of the countries in Southeast Asia have official and unofficial minorities. And the official minorities are ones that are recognized due to a particular intellectual tradition that is derived ultimately from stadialist theories of social development, like Morgan's theory, mid-19th century ethno-hierarchies of, you develop from more primitive to more advanced or whatever, and codified in Stalin's view of ethnicity, which was then borrowed ultimately by China, and then from China to Vietnam, and Vietnam to Laos. So there was a kind of chain hierarchy of understanding official minority versus unofficial minority, recognized ethnic groups and non-recognized ethnic groups. Okay, so the thing that you have to have, and this is true of most minorities conceived of as such across all polities, so this theory of what a minority group is very ingrained in most understanding this. So they're supposed to have their own language, culture, territory, and mindset. Okay, so these are however defined. All right, so these are clearly a codification of degrees of otherness as perceived from the base, the standard of the dominant group. So how do they differ from us? And conveniently, if two ethnic groups seem to differ from us in the same way, that is, they have the same traditional clothing, for example, they're just the same group, okay? It doesn't matter what languages they speak, they're just the blank ethnicity, okay? So this is true across most of Southeast Asia. You have a lot of conflating of ethnic groups and languages into official minority groups. And the one group that actually speaks that language usually is benefiting, and all the other groups that are subsumed under that official ethnicity are disappearing, okay? So this is the hierarchy at work in Southeast Asia, okay? So in this part of the world, we're dealing with the state language, which also doubles as an ethnic majority language, okay? So this is what Southeast Asia has, the national language and the state language and the majority ethnic language are all the same, okay? So this is promoting a national identity through an assimilationist policy towards the top group, but you have this intermediate stage of the official ethnic minorities, and then you have various subjugated groups. Now, in Southeast Asia, we have different vectors of determining otherness. And so verticality is very important in Southeast Asia. So the higher up in the mountains you come from, the more peripheral or marginal you are, okay? So you have this lowland people are more central, more close to the ideal, and the higher up in the mountains you are, the more marginal you are. The one exception of sort of suppression of ethnicity and degrading of the minority ethnicity that happens in these countries, and this is true pretty much across Asian countries that have official minorities, is you have a sort of two-way discourse going on. You have, on the one hand, the official discourse which celebrates these minority peoples as community members on equal footing with the majority community, as long as they're displaying their sort of tribal exoticness in their clothing at sort of state-sanctioned events. Otherwise, when they're in school, they're better get rid of that tribalness, and they better not show anything that shows they're indigenous. So that you have this official message of suppression in certain contexts, and then when it feeds, state functions of inclusiveness, then you can express your indigeneity. But otherwise, you better not. Okay, so we'll find this over and over. Now, in the case of Southeast Asia, most of the countries involve some degree of a relationship of the state or the majority population towards the minority population that involves infantilization. That is, the state is the parent, the minority groups are the children that need to be brought up and scolded when appropriate, and whatnot. There's a a very extreme sexualization of the minority groups. Almost all tourist brochures and things, and I'll show you some examples of this in just a second, have nothing but women, or very rarely have men, and if they're men, they're old, okay? So you have dehistoricization as well. So you strip them of their historicity, you sexualize them, and you infantilize them. So this is why the state must develop and control these people. They can't really, they're children after all, they can't really mind themselves. Okay, so here's one from China. There are no men, apparently, of minority groups in China. China has 55 or 54 official ethnic minorities, but roughly 250 languages. The two most ridiculous ones are the Yi and the Gaoshan, who both subsume many, many different language groups. The Taiwanese Aboriginals, of course, are uniting groups whose cleavage is so deep within Austronesian that it's quite absurd on linguistic grounds to consider them one ethnic group or one minority group. So, you know, deeper than Russian, Hindi, and Italian within Indo-European. So, infantilization, we get lots of little children or kind of nice little things in our tourist stuff. This is a more accurate map of China today. Again, if you look at this map, you'll see there's about a 5-to-1 ratio. I mean, in this photo, about a 5-to-1 ratio of women to men. So there's very few tribal men, apparently, and lots of women. Again, huge percentage of women, mainly young, and men, if they're there, mainly older. Okay, so sexualization of minorities. Okay, just quickly, Vietnam, 53 versus roughly 90. Of course, Miss Hill Tribe contest, and they do the same thing there. Laos is an interesting case. Everyone in Laos is Lao. You're either lowland Lao, midland Lao, or upland Lao. Okay, so they're recently have gotten it up to 48 ethnicities. There's roughly half of how many languages there are. There are new languages being emerging to science out of Laos all the time. Map of Laos. This is Lao Hill Tribe promotion. You will see there are 15 photos, one of a man, okay? It's transparent. Cambodia actually has no official minorities, but roughly 25 ethnic groups. But even so, Cambodia manages to sexualize its non-existent minority groups in their tourist brochures. So. Thailand's interesting. Thailand is pretty close to having a full recognized groups. Thailand, in contrast to a country like Laos, has a very strong, I would say, national identity, and maybe that they can recognize all their ethnic groups now that they have a solid ethnic national identity. I mean, so who knows? That's just speculation. It does seem to be a lot closer to reality than a lot of the other Southeast Asian countries. But of course, you'll find things like this out of Thailand too. But lastly, I want to talk about Myanmar and Burma, two highly politicized terms. They mean the same thing. They have come to mean in modern political discourse ethnic Burmese versus national Burmese, but that's, one thing that's interesting about this country, though, is that unlike the rest of the countries, it overestimates the number of languages it has. And the reason that it does that is because there's roughly 120 languages, but 120 is not an auspicious number. It wasn't an auspicious number for Ne Win, who was obsessed with 9 and 5, and particularly multiples of those. So there's 135 ethnic groups in Burma because it's a nice multiple of 9 and 5. And this fetishism of 9 and 5 actually went down into the money. So Burma actually had 45 chat and 90 chat notes rather than 50 and 100. Okay, so numerology is important in this country. Okay, so Southeast Asia, roughly. So we've seen now two different situations. One is a settlement colonialist legacy in Siberia, endangerment very severe. Then we've seen a promotion of a national majority language and the concept of official versus unofficial minorities and how that has a differential effect on the degree of endangerment in these areas because of the differential valuation of these groups in these ethno-linguistic hierarchies that are operative. There's also one thing I won't talk about today, but is common in parts of Africa and in, for example, New Guinea, where you have the legacy of trade or exploitation colonies, where you basically have, rather than the metropole language instituting itself and spreading out and killing all the other languages from the colonial center, you have the enfranchising of some middleman group or a Creole type community that becomes the lingua franca or whatever. So that's kind of a trade exploitation colony legacy, are middleman languages or contact languages becoming the lingua francas. Now the last thing we're going to look at is the last two remaining hotspots that I'll talk about, the subcontinent and the Western Australasia. In these cases, you have two very different types of environment, but they're both trying to promote sort of quasi-de-ethnicized national languages as national identity vectors, okay? The Philippines would be a country like that, where there's a national language that is essentially de-ethnicized Tagalog that is being promoted as a national identity vector, okay? So first going to talk about India and tribal people in India. So India is obsessed with two things, development and their ostensible post-colonial present, okay? The post-colonial present is not shared by the tribal people in India. They are living in a neo-colonialist present, and the development has basically nothing but negative consequences for these people, okay? So development means becoming Hindu, and becoming a low-caste Hindu is what development means. So officially, a tribal community in India, according to the Constitution, has to have these characteristics: indications of primitive traits, a distinctive culture, shyness of contact with the community at large, geographic isolation, and backwardsness. So you can see that the Morgonian language, not really here, but mindset and territory and culture, as defined by them as being backwards and primitive from the perspective of mainstream Indian culture. Okay, so, I mean, primitive and backwards are actually in the official definitions. So you can imagine these people are not widely regarded, highly regarded amongst the general populace when they're considered primitive and backwards officially. Okay, so this is the Munda language family. Talk a little bit about Munda right now. Munda is a tribal family. There are no non-tribal languages in Munda, unlike Dravidian and Indo-Aryan, where you have tribal and non-tribal peoples based on that set of criteria. You know, they still sexualize. This is about the development. But apparently you need a photo of a young woman smiling on your educational development book. Primitive Tribes of Orissa. This is my favorite. This came out last year. Encyclopedia of Primitive Tribes in India. Apparently there are no men in these communities. Okay, so I've already gone on about this. This is Peter Berger has very scathingly critiqued the uses of indigeneity and against and for tribal communities in Orissa. Recommend this article. It's cited. Okay, the language hierarchy in India is very, very strong and very deep. Okay, so we're dealing with a community like the beer whore. Is this going to work? All right, it's not going to work, right? You don't see anything. Anyway, beer whore, illiterate tribal at the bottom. When they get settled, they were nomadic people. They adopt the identity and language of Mundari and Ho. There's one area where they adopted Santali. Santali has a special status because it's an official language of India. However, even though it's an official language of India, it's still valued lower than Sadani or Sadri, which is the tribal Indo-Aryan variety. So Indo-Aryan over non-Indo-Aryan, that's one of the key hierarchies here. Hindu, non-Hindu, that's another key hierarchy here. So there's religious hierarchies. We have religious hierarchies, we have I guess, broadly speaking, ethnic hierarchies and such. So what this means is the beer whore never have access to English, okay? They can maybe get up to the Odia or Bengali level. No beer whore has ever reached the Hindi competence level, and certainly no beer whore speaks English or ever has, and likely ever will. So this hierarchy kind of rigidly caps your upward mobility in India. Okay, so Gita literacy and development. Well, in 1971, the state of female literacy was quite poor. It was at 0.0. After 30 years of education, it managed to rise to 3.4%. So that's a pretty stellar achievement of 30 years of development. Well, why doesn't it work? Well, it doesn't work because the kids get told in school that everything about their identity is terrible, that they, the fact that they eat beef. In fact, if you eat beef, you cannot learn, was a quote that one of the school teachers in Orissa said. So you have to drink milk and not eat beef. Munda people think drinking milk is a form of bestiality, and that eating meat is exactly what you need to do with cows, okay? So they have completely inverted norms with relationship with cattle than Hindu people do, okay? Now, these languages are still at the initial endangerment stage, but they're showing the shifts that I was mentioning. So a new system has been introduced into these languages where they're case marking on the nouns when it used to only ever go in the verb, like it still does in beer whore. They've lost the agreement marking altogether in Gita and just now mark it like it's Oriya, basically. So again, we're looking at using native lexemes, but with converging on the syntax of another language, okay? The subcontinent. So what we've been doing in India is working together with communities to develop online resources. And so this is some of the dictionaries they've built. This is the Koroaka. This is up in northeast India. Apatani, another Tibeto-Burman language from northeast India. I can demonstrate these things later. We're doing another version of this. So one of the things we've been working with, one of the things we've been working with here is I've been working together with this man since 2007 and this one since 2008. And we've been doing various documentation projects. They're both native speakers of different Munda languages. He has a PhD. The other one is finished his MA, so he's studying at the MPhil level right now. So we have good hopes that... they're very useful in gaining access to the communities. They're basically, once they get into the communities, then we're welcome and we have no problems with them because they're from those areas. So they're... in that sense, access to these communities is not a problem for us because we have basically contacts everywhere. All right, so I'm going to just finish up with the Western Pacific, Western Australasia. In here we have two countries I'm going to look at briefly. One is Philippines and the other one is Indonesia. So here we have several hierarchies. You have the sort of constructed national language, and then you have various regionally dominant languages, and then you have sort of the threatened and minority languages that we're concerned with here. Now, here in the Philippines, it's still pretty small. And if we look at the sort of valorization clines in the Philippines, we have the national language at the top. We have these 8 languages of wider communication, the local ethnic languages, and then the most endangered languages tend to fall into the Negrito post-forager lex. So again, we're dealing with valorization clines here of the center, periphery, rural versus urban, Christian versus Muslim or animist, and Austronesian phenotype versus Negrito phenotypes. Okay, so there's these different valorization clines that all go into this hierarchy of why certain languages are more endangered than others here. So the languages of this, you guys all know that, so we saw this map earlier. It's a colorful one. So, all right, now this is, all right. Just on remember these numbers, we haven't had them again, but just wanted to remind you of them. So I'm going to look at some numbers now. So if you take all of the languages that are threatened or endangered here. This is just one set. Roughly, we're dealing with 4, so at the endangered level. So it's not, Siberia is below 2, all right? So Siberia is terrible. Siberia can't be helped. Here can. Okay, this is the takeaway. Siberia is doomed, basically. The languages of Siberia will disappear, except for 1 or 2 of them, because there's almost no desire among the communities to keep them. So, now, Indonesia has a similar hierarchy, different players. Of course, we have Bahasa Indonesia as the nationally dominant language. Then we have these regionally dominant, locally dominant, then the very localized vernacular languages. And then, of course, we have the Papuan languages, which are valorized at the very bottom. Again, we're dealing with center, periphery, urban, rural, lowland, upland. So we're, again, going back into the Southeast Asian hierarchies here. Christian, Hindu, animist, Austronesian, Papuan. And of course, Bahasa is a rebranded version of High Malay. So de-ethnicized and promoted as a national language through this fairly insidious process of transmigrasi, which is effectively installed Indonesian in most places. Okay, there's some really big languages in Indonesia. What's interesting in Indonesia, though, is that the hierarchy is very real, and you have these endangerment shifts. So we're finding situations where we have, like Wayan Arka has done a really interesting study here, talking about a language at that 4th rank, that local vernacular rank, shifting to a language that's locally dominant, but speakers of Wairena are changing to Manggarai, so one of the regionally dominant languages, but in turn Manggarai speakers are shifting to Bahasa Indonesia. So we're finding these chains of shifts as you go up the hierarchy. Okay. Now, Indonesia has a lot more languages and a lot more endangered languages, and thus tackling the problem in Indonesia is going to be significantly more difficult than it is here, exponentially more difficult, simply because there's 10 times more languages involved. The Philippines has a real chance to do something with their linguistic legacy. It really is at a threshold point where it can do something and make a difference. In a place, like I said, like Siberia, that ship sailed already. So now just Asia in general overall, roughly something this. So overall, Asia as a whole, as a region, macro-regionally, isn't too bad, 4.33. So that's in between locally endangered and endangered. So that's not so terrible as a macro area. If you compare that with North America, for example, it's significantly better. So just to compare the different areas, so we see that in the former settlement colony, we have severe endangerment as the result. In Southeast Asia, where we're having national language promotion, so national majority language promotion, we're, again, not anywhere nearly as bad as Siberia, but worse off than the other places where there's, in here, we're promoting national languages that are de-ethnicized and don't belong to a majority, even if they belong to a plurality population. And then you have the subcontinent, of course, because they've only started implementing. The government doesn't have that much effect in India. That's one of the great joys of like the development scheme, is that none of the kids are actually going to school, which is the vector where they're learning how to not be tribal, okay? So it's a great irony that it's the dysfunction of India that's keeping some of its linguistic legacies alive in a better state than similar ecologies would predict. So just to sum up, we have the consequences of imperialist subjugation and overtly racist ideologies is extreme shift and lots of language extinction. When we're in Southeast Asia, we're dealing with a national majority language and a hierarchy that involves official versus unofficial minorities. In this region, we're dealing with the national languages, de-ethnicized, and then various degrees of locally dominant languages, and in some cases, these endangerment chains, like we saw. And then India has all of these complex things which involve religious indoctrination as well as linguistic assimilation and other things. So it's really its own complex way in many ways. And is this going to work? That's just putting those into the numbers, showing how the different ecologies correlate to different sort of average levels of endangerment. And just in case you were wondering how the Asian polities, Asian language hotspots line up with the other ones, we have Southeast Asia, the Western Pacific, subcontinent Himalayas down there. So overall, not too bad. Siberia is, of course, up there looking kind of grim. So as I said, in summary, in old settlement colonies like Siberia, the shift is already so far advanced that, and with a lack of community desire to restore the languages, there's nothing linguists can do. We can document the languages for legacy because the community desire just isn't there. You can't force people to speak a language they don't want to speak. So we as linguists working in Siberia have a legacy to subsequent generations of that community and science because these dynamics shift. We know this. Fortunately, as I mentioned, Asia is lagging behind some of the worst areas in the world. So action can be taken, but that time for action is right now. So thank you.
Dakal Asalamat, thank you very much to Dr. Anderson for enlightening us on the current situation of our linguistic landscape, particularly our linguistic ecologies. You know, he presented to us a wide range of situations ranging from Siberia to China to our Southeast Asian neighbors in Myanmar, even to a country really close to the Philippines like Indonesia. And here he presented the forces at play when it comes to the hierarchies present in our ecology, particularly the forces of ideologies brought about by the government that suppresses linguistic identities and at the same time promotes ethnic identities through a sanction of state sanctioning of indigenousness. And also there are also factors like infantilization, the treatment of ethno-linguistic groups as children, little children, sexualization, a really big problem. You know, keeps on saying that there are no men in the presentation of our linguistic identities, and also the dehistorization or stripping of modernity and historical context of our ethno-linguistic groups. And he ended it with saying that here in the Philippines, we still have hope in preserving our linguistic identity. May pag-asa pa, and we cling to that hope. Thank you very much, Dr. Anderson. And now it is time for our panel sessions. And may we call on our distinguished panelists for our panel session. And for the table to be made ready here in front for our panel session. And again, we invite everyone, sa lahat po ng mga kababayan, na ilike po ang page ng Facebook ng KWF, pati na rin po. Live po tayo ngayon sa RTVM. Kaya pakishare po para po sa mga kababayan natin na wala pa po rito. At ngayon po, ngayon po ay tinatawagan ko na po para po sa kanyang panayam hinggil sa wikang nasa panganib, paulit-ulit na estado o di kasalukuyan. Narito po si Dr. Salem Meshud.
Later. When I need it out. Good afternoon, everybody, and I also join Gregory in wishing to thank everybody who invited us there. It's a great honor to be here. A couple of months ago, I would not have thought that I would come here and talk about endangered languages in the Philippines, especially that I've been working mostly recently in Africa, and most of the work that we've been doing is through the Foundation for Endangered Languages. and which invites you all, of course, to get in touch if you're anything. We know we provide grants for research on endangered languages. So I'm conveying the greetings of the foundation to everybody. I'm very happy that Gregory has explained all this, because basically he laid the grounds to most of the work that has been done in endangered languages. And most of the research that has been done, I think he summarized it quite well, and you'll see that each one of us who would come here and talk about different communities will find most of the things exposed by Gregory here will be, could apply and will apply and do apply to other situations. Therefore, what I was thinking of doing is actually take you out of linguistics, take you out of the research that has been done in terms of documentation, etc., but just explore some other ways of promoting and defending languages and trying to prevent or at least stop endangerment. So most of the time we talk about language diversity, but what I really want to do is make everybody think that when we're thinking of language diversity, we're thinking also of biodiversity. Many linguists, in fact, have put language diversity in the same mold as biodiversity. It's part of biodiversity. And these days, we can see that, I think in the earlier session, Greg was talking about all the different animals that are disappearing. We are now, one of the things that is very fashionable to think about, it has become extremely important to think about, is the disappearance of bees, for instance. Just one little insect, one little tiny animal, if it disappears, it endangers all of us, the lives of all of us. So think of each language as a bee. So what I want to do is, language is part of the planet diversity. And the second thing that I want to say, I'll try and go quickly through it, is that most of the threats to languages come from humans, not from anybody else. And therefore, what do we do to stop humans from endangering this diversity? Well, it's easy. Diversity is about variety, interdependence, interrelatedness, and sustainability, and the same can be said of languages. Most languages are interconnected, interrelated, and they all together contribute to the sustainability of our living environment. It's an ecosystem, and the threat of disappearance, as I said earlier, I mentioned the bees. So this is what we have to think about, I think. I don't want to impose you the idea, but just try to make you think that this is how we could probably look at it. It's another way of looking at it. So imagine if only one species, for instance, I picked up a zebra, but you can imagine any other things about the planet. All the animals die and only one species return. Whenever you go out, you find zebra. Zebra to ride, zebra to eat, zebra to listen to, zebra, whatever. You replace zebra by something else. We just thought they were cute. And that's why, but I mean, anyone would have done. And I quoted this. I started my abstract with this quote from David Crystal. And yes, it's like a person is dead. But as I tried to explain, when a person dies, the human beings continue, if the ecology is sustained, they will produce little ones. We all have children and grandchildren, etc. When languages die, they don't. Sometimes when they half die, they do have offspring, as we said. The Romance languages all came from Latin, which is dead. And Indo-European, Proto-Indo-European died, but left lots of other things. But when the language dies completely, it doesn't actually, most of the time, give birth to offspring. And this is what a great Malian anthropologist and writer, Amadou Mpateba, summarized it, in fact. He said in Africa, every time an old man dies, it's like an entire library is burned down or up in flames. And this, I think, can be said of all the continents on Earth. And I usually quite like to take this whenever I think of our languages. So I just wanted to add, when he says it's not just the language itself, but all the culture that it vehicles. And I mean, we read Greek, we read Latin, we read Sanskrit, we read all sorts of things, and we have a body of literature that has been left over. But most of the time we have nothing, and we don't know anything about the cultures that had gone by. So this is, I said, most of the thing responsible to this is the human threat. And of course, as you've read it many times and you've thought about it, I'm just summarizing it. It could be the result of aggression, like war and conflict. And most of the time it's dominance. Dominance can be through as the colonial or imperialist dominance through conquest. But sometimes it's just people inheriting it. I mean, present-day Americans, for instance, are not the ones who have killed the American Indians. It's their ancestors, but they've inherited this dominance anyway. Sorry for the Americans in the room, but it can apply to everybody. It could be imposed immediately after conflict, but as we say, there is the insidious dominance that continues, and I think Gregory gave us some very good examples of that. And sometimes it's not even insidious. It's quite there, plain to see to everybody. And it vehicles itself, this thing, through national channels, as we have seen in the Himalayas and things, but also through international channels. Dominance from the outside and dominance from the inside. It's either inter-ethnic, inter-community, or inter-nations. And that's we've had all those international wars, etc. So anyway, this is a summary of human aggression. And so we have the prestige language of the national community or the international language. I think I'll go quickly because I think, again, we've heard it from Greg summarized very nicely. This is one thing, for instance. I think the United Nations, which is today composed of 192 countries. You can take 192 countries, each one of them, you multiply all the languages that they have, and we just say that 192 countries represent about 8,000 languages. And yet there are 6 official languages in the United Nations. How did they pick them up? How did they pick up those languages in 1946 when the United Nations was created? It was because it was the languages of the victors, the ones who won the war. Is Spanish a bigger language than German? Or is it bigger than Italian? Or French, bigger than Russian? No, but the French and the Spanish and the English and the Russians won. The Germans didn't. The Italians didn't. Therefore, their language was not represented. Even that. So it's not even a matter of what language is, let's say, more developed, to use a cliche. It's who speaks or expresses that language. The French linguist André Martinet once said that a language is a dialect with a navy and an army. And this is reproduced all the time. It's who has the money, the navy and the army and the politics, basically. And then, at the beginning, there was French, Spanish, and English. And then Russian was more or less the official language. But what happened afterwards? Chinese, and good heavens, Arabic became an official language of the United Nations. Why? Why Arabic and not Chinese before it? Why any other way, not German, for instance? Because in 1970s, when it was adopted, late 60s, the Arabic-speaking countries had the upper hand with the oil, after the oil crisis, for instance. And everybody thought oil dollars were important, and therefore we'll buy the oil money with the language, Arabic. And yet when you look at the way that these languages are used at the United Nations, they say official languages, but actually 6 official languages. And in the beginning it was 4 working languages. And then a lot of them, then we had 6 and then 3 official and 6 official and only 3, that is French, Spanish, and English, and then say, well, we can all have them as working languages. And now, in fact, in de facto, especially after all those UN huge conferences, like the World Conference Against Racism in South Africa, the World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna in 1993, they cost so much in translations and things. I think 40 tons of paper were shipped from New York and Geneva to Vienna for just that conference of a few days. And every day in the work of the United Nations, if you have to translate every document that is produced in all the 6 languages, then more than 2/3 of the budget of the United Nations will probably go there. So then what do you do? And in fact, there's a de facto thing now. English is the working language. Even at the UNESCO in Paris, where French was usually the working language, now English has superseded it, basically. And the same in Geneva. And how do you then weigh up the power? Which has more power? I mean, Russian, hardly anyone at the United Nations uses the Russian language documents, apart from Russia, because most of even the old countries which are part of the Soviet Union, who usually are fluent in Russians, but they don't like Russian sometimes. I'm using cliches and stereotypes here, but a lot of them actually don't like to use Russians. The Georgians and the Azerbaijan and all things, they prefer to use English. So then we have an official language, a working language of the United Nations, which one member state uses. And Chinese, only China uses it, because Taiwan is not a member of the United Nations. Spanish, yes, but I mean, Arabic, most of the people use English anyway. And the other thing is that the number of countries which speak Arabic has been conflated, and a lot of the so-called Arabic-speaking countries are actually not Arabic-speaking. So I'll let you reflect on that. So, one of the reasons, one of the things that we're talking about the policies, where did it all start? Why do we take one language and make it this big thing? Because there is this legacy of the European colonial heritage, basically, which says that there have to be a national language for everything. And so most of the colonial administrations imposed the colonial language. That's perfectly normal. But after colonialism was finished, basically, the ideology stayed. So you have a country with 60 languages, let alone 200, but we have to have a national language. But without actually even thinking or looking at whether there is actually a useful way of dealing with it, it's just that we have to have one national language. And it has been done, and very often you pick one, as I think Greg was saying about the ones that have been taken in Africa, for instance, it was Swahili and Hausa. Swahili is spoken throughout the east coast of Africa, so there is a certain amount of things. It's a lingua franca. Hausa is spoken in about 2 countries in Africa, but because one of them is Nigeria, it's huge and has a large population, it was picked up in order to replace English or French as one of the national languages or whatever of Africa. That's based on nothing either linguistically or sociologically founded, but mainly on ideology, colonial, post-colonial, etc. So I went back and I looked at the first time that, apart from Latin, which we used, of course, throughout the Latin Empire, or Greek, which was also lingua franca and all things, but in modern states, since the Renaissance, the first time that somebody decided there's going to be a national language was King François Ier, Francis I of France. He had this ordinance. Villers-Cotterêts is the village where he was at the time when he signed it. And he decided at the time that Latin nobody understood, and most of his citizens were actually not even schooled, or they were illiterate. And so when you take them, when they go to court, they don't understand all the people who are giving all this Latin legal language. So he said it has to be in the language of the people, the everyday life, which is a fantastic idea. He was the Renaissance king par excellence, in a way. I'm saying it in French that way. But he did something that no one probably had done before, that the language of the people is going to be officially used in the courts and everywhere. However, the language that he thought about was the language spoken in this tiny little thing around where the king lives, in the Ile-de-France, the Isle of France, basically. And that became the French language. But then huge chunks, basically the entire 90% of the French territory who spoke Occitan, which is now an endangered language, and all the other languages, like the Celtic languages, Breton, but basically disappeared. So then we create a national language, sometimes even for the good cause. That's why I chose this for two reasons. One, it's probably the oldest. The other one, it's probably for a good cause, from his point of view. And yet, it endangers all the other languages in France, like Catalan or of the time, and Occitan and all that. Right, I've just said it, so you can, that's probably why it started. I cannot be absolutely certain that this is the things, but it's probably what started the ideology. And you all know this one, of course, when somebody said that we're going to have German or Spanish recognized as a language of the United States. Somebody said, why do we have Spanish or German in the United States? English is good. If it's good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. So that's why, and they're still fighting now, because the Hispanic community is supposed to be growing to the point that it's going to be much larger than the English-speaking community in the United States, and this worries a hell of a lot of people in the United States. There's, Gregory probably knows, there's the campaign for True English, or for One English, whatever it's called. It started in California in the 1980s to preserve, because there is no legal national language in the United States, unlike many countries. So it just, it's there. And some people think that we should have English as the national language of the United States. And it was started somewhere in California, I think, by a Japanese speaker. And anyway, if Japanese is good enough for him. Right. So now I'm coming to the things. I'm not the only one to think this, and a lot of people have organized themselves in order to fight this aggression and stop it. And it's, I believe anyway, that it can only be done through international action. No country, as we have seen, can do it by themselves. No ethnic group, no language community can do it by itself. It has to be through solidarity. That's why we're all here at the beginning. It's because we have to work together and have norms and standards which are recognized and respected by everybody on the planet. We are a planet, but again, biodiversity, that's the only way we can fight this. It's through international actions. Yes, of course, there are United Nations and regional legal instruments which protect languages. I mean, I mentioned the UN Declaration of the Rights of Minorities, the UNESCO Declaration on Cultural Diversity, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and other things like the Atlas for Endangered Languages. Some of us have participated in these. Michael and things. We were in he was one of the editors of the UNESCO Atlas of Endangered Languages. I'll come back to the reason I'm mentioning it, but also the UN Declaration of the Rights of Minorities, for instance, was very good as a declaration, but as soon as it was adopted, it was practically forgotten. And some regional things, I mean, in Europe, for instance, which said, okay, now we've done something, we have to do it. They have a framework convention on regional languages. And who do you think wants it? So some of the Central European countries have followed it, but one of the biggest obstacles to its adoption and promotion is France. France, back to the ordinance earlier, but for a different reason now, does not want to recognize that in France there are other languages than French. So why do we want regional languages? You know, we have French, it's the best language in the world. And so, and this is where we're stuck in many ways. And that framework, it's a convention. Most of you know the difference between a declaration and a convention. A declaration is just it's a set of principles that everybody agrees on. A convention is a legal instrument which is binding. The declaration is not binding. So this is the important thing. And we go back to the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, for instance. It took about 30 years to draft. And I was part of the drafting of the last 5 years or something like that. What was interesting in that declaration was not necessarily the text itself, but the process. The process was unique in international law and international organizations because it was actually not like most conventions are drafted by the member states, by the ambassadors of the member states. The Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was actually drafted by the representatives of indigenous peoples. They were there most of the time. And because of that, it was fantastic for the indigenous peoples and extremely worrying and threatening for the governments. Why? Because the standards that indigenous peoples were bringing in were actually so far out and so higher than the normal legal cant that governments usually come up with, that started worrying people. And just to give you an example, one of the earlier, we started with, in English, it's actually called the indigenous populations, the working group. In other languages, like French and Spanish, it's peoples. It's el pueblos or le peuple. In English, it's populations. So a lot of people say, why should we? We're not a population, we are a people. Because if you're a people, you have an existence in law as well, in international law. So we have to be called peoples. And then, okay, the English speakers change it to people, but then the United Declarations of the Rights of Indigenous People. And then the others say, no, in French and Spanish, I think it's peoples. So we are not a people, which is sort of this abstract entity which nobody says. We are peoples. That means we are entities with rights and legal things. So there was, before people even started to discuss the adoption of this thing, there's a big fight on S, peoples, the S at the end of people in English. So people were going there with little things, just with S around it, all over the place. And you can see how these things can become really, really heated for something that looks totally silly, S, at the end of an English word. But that really is extremely important, because in French and Spanish, I'm citing the other working languages, it's peoples, and each people has the right. Whereas there's indigenous people, as though we have the peoples of the United States, and indigenous people are just this sort of undefined entity which is outside. So that was one of the first things. The second thing, when the actual drafting then started, was how to start it. And we're talking about sovereignty, we're talking about self-determination. Self-determination became an extremely important thing for indigenous peoples. But where to do it, where to put it in the declaration? And there were several weeks of debate on how to phrase it. And then someone had the idea, said, why don't we go back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and what followed it? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is just a declaration, found its life as a legal instrument in 1965 as two separate instruments, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Social, Economic and Cultural Rights. Each one of them begins with Article 1, which is all peoples have the right of self-determination. So it's usually referred to as Common Article 1 of the covenants, of the two covenants. So it was decided that to take exactly as it was, that Common Article 1 from the two covenants, and begin the declaration with that. In the end, it became Article 3. But the self-determination bit was so important that many countries then started to stop their cooperation. Because if you're talking about self-determinations of indigenous peoples, what happens of the states? In fact, back in 1965, when these two covenants were adopted, two countries objected to the first article, India and Brazil. And they put on reservations. That's what they do for these international conventions. Put a reservation, which means you adopt the text, but for this particular article, you reserve the right to interpret it differently. And the text of India said, we reserve I'm citing by head, not verbatim, but we reserve to interpret Article 1 as applying only to the self-determination of a nation against another nation. That was the two reservation back in 1965. So when, in 1993, afterwards, this became Article 3 of the Declaration of Indigenous Peoples, then the country said, oh, here we go again. If the indigenous people have the right of self-determination, how far do you go with that? Secession, and, autonomy, independence, and then you start having problems. And then for the entire two-thirds of the process, you had countries, developed countries like Britain, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, France, supporting the text because they see it as empowering indigenous peoples against, perhaps, you can quote me, but just as for my own opinion on this, against the dictatorships, etc. That's one of these things. Suddenly, determination of indigenous, but we have indigenous peoples in Canada, in the United States, in New Zealand, and then you found those 4 countries were the greatest obstacles. Canada was fine at one point, and then it was Quebec. Quebec, because when Canada bought into the declaration, Quebec said, oh my God, but we have the American Indians, the 6 nations, the traditional nations as they call them, in there. And they don't want separation from Canada, for instance, but Quebec wants 10 minutes, then it's going to be a bit difficult. Okay, just started. Anyway, so you can see how these things become... so anyway, I'm skipping the linguists because we've heard all that, and it says that the linguists have a responsibility to do this. This is the status of the Permanent Committee of Linguists. I'll skip that. Okay, but that's the main thing. We say linguists, 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 but it's not just up to the linguists to defend endangered languages. It's up to every one of us. Oops. So if language is fundamental to human beings, this is the main thing. The free enjoyment of language is a fundamental right. And we have protection. The Convention of the Rights of the Child, for instance, protects the right to the language, for instance, the right of the child to be educated in his or her own language. I mentioned the 2 covenants. So there are international instruments which actually mention language, but there are none which are dedicated to language. So we've got, basically, I'm not going to talk about in international law and human rights, there's group rights and individual rights, and the entire human system, since the legal system of international legal system since the Second World War is about individual rights. But then we are confronted with the system of universal human rights and cultural rights, and that's why language has been used sometimes. We have different rights. If each country has a different right, then we have no universal rights, and that applies to language. We can discuss this later, since I only have some time. Okay, these are the articles of the things which are, as you can see, nationality, name recognition with the language. The UNESCO, you know, I'm not going to come back to it. This I've just spoken about. Now, this is one of the interesting things that's been taking place since the late 90s and mid 2000s. There was a conference, international conference in Barcelona, the Barcelona Declaration, which is talking about linguistic rights. But lo and behold, this was not organized officially. It was organized by the PAN International, and a lot of the United Nations and international organizations actually did not even, including UNESCO, but UNESCO is also a club of government. This I've just mentioned. Now, because the reason I'm saying all this is because I want to bring it back to another things. For those of you who are not really familiar with it, in international law and human rights law, there are certain rights which are called non-derogable rights. That means whatever happens in any circumstance, these rights stand there. Even if you can change the law of certain conventions, amend them, etc., these cannot change. And that's the freedom from torture, slavery and slave trade, the right to life, and genocide. There's a sort of half a dozen of them. Non-derogable right. Nothing you do, even if it's in state of war or state of emergency, these rights stay, that you cannot derogate from them. So this is really why I'm coming to that. If they're non-derogable rights, we have to use all the instruments to everything. As I said, it's all of us. We have to use everything, not just linguistics, not just documentation, not just everything. We have to look at, if we're together, this is a biodiversity, it's an international thing, we have to act together as a planet, as a biodiverse planet in the things. And My little thing, that's right, still vulnerable rights, these legal instruments also, because there are many, when I say we work together, first of all, look at what are the existing instruments. For instance, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples should become a convention. So we have to start the fight now to make a non-binding instrument like a declaration to become an international convention, which is then a binding instrument. It's a legal instrument. And the other thing that doesn't exist yet, but all the ones which already exist are actually violated every day. They're not promoted, they're not employed, they're not used, and they're ignored. And this is when we have every day of our life, we have to make sure that this law, exactly as we all do in our own countries, a law is violated, we take people to court, we call them to things, they're arrested or whatever. It should be the same with this international, and we have to fight for them. And so where I'm coming through, I've promoted this idea since 2004 at the Foundation for Endangered Languages conference in Barcelona, whose topic was linguistic rights. This is where I came up with this idea, but it has not been pursued yet. If some rights are absolutely necessary, part of human beings and things, and we cannot derogate from them, they are the things. And we've just tried to prove that language is part of our culture, part of our identity. Language is part of the human personality. So you cannot torture somebody because you violate their integrity, their personal integrity. And therefore you cannot take language for them because you take away their dignity. And this is why I think we should campaign for linguistic rights to become non-derogable rights. It hasn't really advanced very much, but I hope, as I say, as John Lennon said, I'm not, I'm probably a dreamer, but I hope I'm not the only one. Thank you very much.
Maraming salamat po kay Dr. Salem Masood ng King's College, London, for reminding us of the different nuances of our language, particularly in history, talking about language being used as a tool, being weaponized. We need to understand the history of language and understand history in order to articulate the history of our languages. And also, he mentioned other particular rights and instruments we could use, mga babasahin po natin, uunawain natin ng ganap, no, tulad po ng Universal Declaration of Linguistic Rights na ginawa po ng mga manunulat, no, mula sa poets, essays, and playwrights, writers of the world. And also reminding us that the defense of indigenous languages is up to in our own hands. You know, everyone is invited and everyone is enjoined to defend indigenous languages all over the world. At ngayon po ay magpapatuloy tayo sa ating sesyong panel at nais ko pong tawagin ang mga kinatawan ng Translators Association of the Philippines sa pangunguna ni Dr. Josephine S. Daguman. Kasama po nila sina Rosario Viloria, Lerma A. Abella at Rodeline Aguilar. Muli po ang Translators Association of the Philippines.
Good afternoon, everyone. In 2014, the Translators Association of the Philippines, in consortium with the Asian School of Development and Cross-Cultural Studies, launched the Community Development Major in Language Development Program. The program aimed to have a learning community that attempts to raise agents of transformational language development for the language communities of the Philippines and beyond. It has a ladderized course offerings from certificate to diploma to master's level. It also had courses under 3 disciplines of community development, linguistics, and language development. It culminated with a participatory research that has an output of mini thesis. Two of such researches were conducted in the island of Coron. So it is this part of the Philippines. And this is the island on close-up. In 2015, the research was conducted in Banwang Daan, and in 2016, in its neighboring village of Kabugao. The general objective of the research was to determine the state of Kalamian Tagbanwa language in these 2 villages. And the specific objectives included to identify the languages Tagbanwa residents use inside and outside of the community, to determine the 2 most used languages and the people who speak them well, to make an initial determination of the state of the mother tongue using the expanded graded intergenerational disruption scale, henceforth EGIDS, and to document the initial language development plans expressed by the community. Those were participatory action researches, and data were gathered through focus group discussions. Here is the sample of grouping when the research was conducted in Barangay Kabugao. Among the tools used were, the primary tool was a guide to planning the future of our language, which provided the guide questions for the focus group facilitation. It also suggested participatory tools like language mapping and the use of Venn diagram for discussion of and discovery of multilingualism. Then there was a mountain illustration that provided popular metaphor for the state of use of the language. It was translated into the mother tongue. Okay. So this is a picture of the mapping exercise. And of the use of the Venn diagram. And this is the mountain illustration used as a metaphor of the EGIDS. This was redrawn and translated into the mother tongue. Answers to questions and results of the discussions were organized into matrices. And then in the course of the research, the first group of researchers used hula hoops as a metaphor for overpowering of the mother tongue by other languages that come into the community. Okay, so this is one of the researchers and the matrices which organized the results of the research. Okay, and that's the use of hula hoops
which served as a metaphor of overpowering mother tongue. Lots of colored papers were used as materials and seeds from local plants.
Resulta ng research.
Results of the research.
Una, tinanong ang mga participants kung ano ang tawag sa salita at kung ano ang tawag sa tao na nagsasalita nito.
First thing, participants were asked what the name of the mother tongue is and the name of the people that speak the language.
Name of language, Tinagbanwa. Name of people, Tagbanwa. Mga wika na ginagamit sa komunidad.
Languages used by the Tagbanwa.
Sa Banwang Daan, Tinagbanwa, Tagalog, Bisaya, Kuyunon at English.
In Banwang Daan, Tinagbanwa, Tagalog, Bisaya, Kuyunan, English.
Sa Kabugaw, Tinagbanwa, Kuyunon, Tagalog, Bisaya, Cagayanan at English.
In Kabugaw, Tinagbanwa, Kuyunan, Tagalog, Bisaya, Cagayanan, English.
Nakasulat sa mga kulay ng papel ang mga wika na ginagamit sa komunidad.
The languages were written in colored paper, hence color coding the responses.
Kulay pula ang nagrepresenta sa salitang Tinagbanwa.
Red represented Tinagbanwa.
Gamit ang mga kulay ng papel upang idikit sa mapa at kung saan ginagamit ang mga salita sa lugar.
Colored papers identical to the ones chosen were used to indicate the language used in which parts of the community.
Dalawang pinakagamit na wika.
The two languages mostly used by the Tagbanwa.
Sa Banwang Daan, Tinagbanwa at Tagalog.
In Banwang Daan, Tinagbanwa and Tagalog.
Sa Kabugaw, Tinagbanwa at Kuyunon.
In Kabugaw, Tinagbanwa and Kuyunan.
Nakasulat po sa Nakasulat po sa Tinagbanwa ang mga grupo na Tinagbanwa lang po ang alam na salita.
Okay. Here are the people written on the sheets of paper that speak only Tagbanwa.
At nakasulat din po sa gitna ng Tinagbanwa at Kuyunon ang mga grupo na ang alam ay Tinagbanwa at Kuyunon lang po ang salita.
In the intersection of the two circles are names of people who can speak both Tinagbanwa and Kuyunan.
Gamit ang hulahop, ipinaliwanag sa mga participants kung anong pwedeng posibleng mangyari sa aming salita pag hindi na ito ginagamit.
Using multicolored hula hoops, I explained to the participants what may happen to our language if we allow other languages to overpower our mother tongue.
Sinabi ng mga participants na kung posibleng mangyari po yun sa aming language, kailangan daw po kami ay magtulong-tulong upang maibalik ang aming lingwahe.
The participants said that if such a thing, meaning overpowering of the mother tongue, can really happen to our language in the future, then we should get together as a community and defend our language.
Dahil po sa kanilang realization sa mga kabataan,
Because of their realization, the youth,
nakapagbahagi po sila ng kanilang naranasan
they express their experiences
sa school dahil po nilalait ang mga tagbanwa.
in school because there the Tagbanwas were being oppressed.
Nagkaroon po sila ng lakas ng loob at nagkaroon po ng kasabihan.
They that's hard to say. They gained strength. They gained confidence, and came up with a slogan.
Nasasabihin po na, "Yu Tagbanwa, hindi ikaw yako ang Yu Tagbanwa."
I am Tagbanwa, and I am not ashamed to be called Tagbanwa.
Ipinakita po ang mountain metaphor.
This mountain illustration as metaphor of the Aegids level was shown.
At tinanong po ang mga participants kung saan banda na po sa bundok na yan ang paggamit ng aming salita.
And participants were asked to identify where in the mountain they think their language is at right now.
Pareho po yung resulta sa Barangay Banwang Daan at Barangay Kabugaw.
The result for the two venue of the research were the same.
Spoken by all, written by some.
Spoken by all, written by some.
Pagkatapos lumabas ang resulta, ng pag-aaral,
After the results was done,
tungkol sa kalagayan ng salita sa Barangay Banwang Daan at Barangay Kabugaw,
so after the results were made, after the research in the two villages,
napagdesisyonan ng mga matatanda na hindi lang dapat sinasalita, dapat isinusulat din po ito.
that the language should not only be spoken but also be written.
At napagdesisyonan din po nila na kailangan din pong maidokumento.
The elders all decided that it should be documented.
At magawaan po ng libro
And a book will also be produced
upang maisulat ang aming tradisyon at kultura.
so that our traditional culture will be written,
Lalo na po ang gramatika ng Tinagbanwa.
especially the grammar of our language.
Noong Hulyo hanggang Agosto, taong 2008, nagkaroon ng facilitators training sa opisina ng Translators Association of the Philippines.
In July and August of 2017, there was a facilitators training done at Translators Association of the Philippines office.
Na kung saan dinaluhan po ito ng mga matatanda ng bawat komunidad.
This was attended by the elders of the different island communities, villages of Palawan, of Coron,
At ilang piniling kabataan.
and other chosen youth from the villages also,
Upang sila ang unang magsanay
so that they will be the first to learn and be trained
ng aming tunog, pagbigkas, at ponema ng Tinagbanwa.
so that they will be trained in learning the sound and phonemes of our language.
upang sa kanilang pag-uwi sa kanilang komunidad,
so that when they go back to their villages,
sila na po ang mag-facilitate sa kanilang barangay.
they will be the one to facilitate the sessions with their community people.
Ito po yung phoneme ng Tinagbanwa.
The sounds and phonemes of Tinagbanwa as analyzed by the elders.
At pagkatapos po, yung buong team po ay nag-ikot po sa bawat barangay.
So the team of elders and youth went around the island villages of Tagbanwa people group.
Upang yung komunidad po ay sila naman po yung, parang sila yung makadiscover din po ng aming pagbigkas, tunog at ponema.
So that the people also will be the one to realize and analyze our language, our sound and phonemes.
Noong ika-9 hanggang ika-24 ng Abril taong 2008, nagkaroon po ng malaking pagpupulong sa barangay Banwang Daan.
In April of this year, there was a big conference in our area.
Na tinawag na komperensya yang bitalang Tinagbanwa.
It was called Language Conference of Tinagbanwa Language.
Dinaluhan po ito ng mga matatandang lalaki at babae ng bawat komunidad.
This was attended by elders of the different village islands and also adult women.
Mga guro, mga kabataan,
teachers and youth also attended.
At ilang opisyalis ng barangay.
Also the barangay officials of the different communities.
Kanila pong napagkasunduan ang mahalagang parte ng ortografiyang Tinagbanwa.
They decided and they agreed upon the important parts of the orthography of our language, Tinagbanwa.
Kasama po sa pagpupulong na yon ang Taga-Translator Associations of the Philippines at ang kawani ng komisyon sa wikang Filipino.
Together with us were representatives from Translators Association of the Philippines and the Commission on Philippine Languages.
Pumili ang mga matatanda ng 9 na manunulat ng ortografiyang Tinagbanwa.
The elders chose 9 writers of our orthography.
At noong Hulyo 2008, noong Hulyo 28, sinimulan ng mga 9 na pinili ang paggawa ng mga parte ng ortografiya.
So the 9 writers chosen by the elders put together the results of the conference, and they started in July writing all those things, putting them all together.
Sa ngayon po, 2 beses na po kaming nakapasa ng draft sa KWF.
At this time, we already have submitted 2 drafts to the Commission on Philippine Languages.
At hinihintay na lang po namin itong maaprubahan.
We are just waiting for the Commission sa Wikang Filipino
Thank you.
for the approval of our orthography.
Thank you.
Pag-igtingin po namin ang aming pakikipag-ugnayan sa Departamento ng Edukasyon upang makasali po kami sa MTB-MLA.
We will also intensify our working together with the Department of Education so that we can join the multilingual education program, the Mother Tongue First multilingual education program of the country.
Tawangan nami yang ampuanta.
God will help us.
Maraming salamat po kina Dr. Josephine De Guzman, Rosario Viloria, Lerma A. Abella, Rodeline A. Aguilar ng Translators Association of the Philippines, pati na rin po ng komunidad ng mga kapatid nating Tagbanwa sa Coron, Palawan. Our conference is also a showcase of best practices of the primary stakeholders like the Tagbanwas of Palawan working together with dynamic organizations like the Translators Association of the Philippines in upholding their linguistic and cultural rights. At nais ko po muling patayuin ang mga kapatid nating Tagbanwa na sina Lerma Abella at Rodeline Aguilar. Palakpakan po natin sila. They are the hope, our indigenous hope, the hope of the Tagbanwa language. Mabuhay kayo. At ngayon po ay magkakaroon muna tayo ng 30 minutong pagitan. Meron po tayong 30-minute break. We will be having a 30-minute break. At pagbalik po natin dito ay inaasahan ng lahat ng mga kalahok na handa na po tayong magtanong sa ating mga taga